Joe's out of town, and I'm going to be filling in. And the sermon that I'm preaching this morning comes from a meditation on the book of Acts. So I've been listening to Acts. Anymore I listen to the Bible more than I read it. And I have like a 45-minute drive to work. So I'll just listen to the Bible as I'm like driving to work. And it's a unique experience if you haven't ever tried just listening through it instead of reading it. You pick up on new things. And so for me, it helps to highlight the narrative aspect of the Bible. It's easier to like digest kind of like the big story of what's going on in these passages. And when I'm reading it, I kind of get verse by verse. I get into that zone where I'm like looking at every word, So a little bit different. But I'm also working on this degree called MFA, Master's in Fine Arts. And I'm taking a class that's like a contemporary art class. So we're learning about all the art that comes after 1945 and the major movements and critics and ideas and stuff like that. And I think I'm like the only Christian in my little class that I'm taking, and we talk about all these artists, and none of them are faith-based. And so sometimes I feel a little bit like, I don't know, like I'm talking to people who really know what they're talking about, and I'm going to a school that serves as a platform for some pretty good discussion, and it's like it's just interesting. You feel kind of like a fish out of water or whatever, and learning about some weird stuff. But it really connects well with the book of Acts. Like I'll listen to Acts, and Acts in a lot of ways is a story of people who are part of this really small movement, and it's the story of the church kind of exploding out into the world, even past Judaism, and interacting with Gentiles who have like radically different worldviews than the early Christians. In the Gospels, you have, it's Jesus talking to other Jews for the most part. And in the Old Testament, you have some stories like Daniel where you have a Jewish person interacting with Gentiles, but a lot of Old Testament stories are people interacting within their, worldview. And so Acts to me, I've just read a lot of things and I'm like, okay, yeah, that kind of relates to my situation. And there's a story in it that I feel like really, really connected. And so I just want to highlight a few things that I see happening in this story. And it's the story of Paul at the Areopagus. So if you are not familiar with it, I'll read it here in a sec. But in this story, Paul is talking to some people that have really different worldviews, and they're basically saying, hey, give us an account of these strange things that you've been talking about. You have been mentioning this Jesus fellow and this resurrection idea, and we'd like you to come and talk to us about that and tell us exactly what you mean. And within this story, I think that there's three things that stand out to me that I kind of have been pulling away from this story and sort of meditating on just a little bit. And so those are the things I'm going to explore in today's sermon. The first one is Paul's, solidarity to Jesus Christ, or if that's not the right word, his belief that Jesus is the ultimate truth, right? And he holds fast to that belief, that it's only Jesus and it's only God, and that these other worldviews are inferior to that worldview. The second thing is that in his belief, he communicates those truths in boldness, so he's not bashful about the things that he believes. And then lastly, in his communication of his beliefs, he brought upon himself some shame, so he experienced some personal shame. And so those are the three aspects that I want to sort of delve into in today's sermon. So the story. In Acts we read, now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing a city full of idols. That's also interesting to me just as an aside because essentially he's observing a city full of artwork, and this is his reaction to the artwork. We would say idols are art today, but back then they would say they're, yeah. I don't even have it written down, but 17, yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, verse 16. I just kind of dropped the ball on my notes there. Sorry. Okay, so this is NASB, Levi, by the way. I do know that. Okay, so now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols. So he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. And also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. Some were saying, "What would this idle babbler wish to say?" Others, "He seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is with which you are proclaiming? For you're bringing some strange things to our ears. So we want to know what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and their boundaries of habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his children. Being then the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead." Now when they had heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, but others said, "We shall hear you again concerning this." So Paul went out of their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with him. So what's the Areopagus anyway? When I first read the story, the picture that I had in my head, you hear about, it's a group of people, all they talk about is like something new, and, in my experience, that's usually like young people, we love to talk about something new, and especially in college, you're hearing all sorts of new ideas, and so you're talking with each other about that. And I kind of, at first, pictured this scene of like a coffee shop where there's like all this hubbub going on, and there's like young people sitting down and talking about, I read this book, and this is what this guy said, and I read this book, and blah, blah, blah. And then I started doing a little bit of research, and I found out that the Areopagus is pretty different than that. So that may have been what the marketplace was like. But when Paul actually got to the Areopagus, he was stepping into a situation that would have been pretty daunting. Okay? The Areopagus was a collection of elders who sat on a hill, and they watched over their city. And these elders were usually retired statesmen, people who worked in public office, who were in good standing. And so they would meet together at night, and there was somewhere around 500 of them that would meet together, and they would talk about the goings on in the city. And it was their job to sort of offer a system of checks and balances for their government, and also to look after the moral benefit of the city. And so there's this famous story from history where a thinker ran into the Areopagus, and it's the story of Socrates. So if any of you ever heard of Socrates, he was an Athenian philosopher, and he ran smack dab into the Areopagus in his life. And so Socrates was this guy who had some different ideas about the nature of the gods and how we're supposed to live our lives. And he would go around talking about those. And one day, this guy went to the oracle at Delphi, and he said, "Who is the wisest man on the earth?" And the oracle said, "It's Socrates." And so Socrates heard about this, and while claiming to know nothing, Socrates went to all the wise people in Athens, and he decided to debate them about the nature of life and reality and the gods and all that stuff. And as he did this, he defeated every single one of them in these debates. He proved himself to be the wisest man, but he also claimed that he was the most ignorant man, that there was so much that he didn't know. And his style of rhetoric, the way that he talked to people, was very captivating for the youth of Athens. And so it's said that Socrates gathered a lot of young people to him with his kind of new radical beliefs. And it captured the attention of the Areopagus. They were like, what are you, what sort of ideas are you trying to plant in the youth of Athens? And they called Socrates in and they questioned him about his beliefs. And they found him wanting, and so they killed him. Okay, so that's what the potential for your interaction with the Areopagus, right? And so they took very seriously the nature of the ideas that were being handed down to the youth of Athens and any new political view that may disrupt the peace, right? And so that's kind of who Paul gets called into to talk with, okay, and to sort of answer to his faith, right, the question of his faith. And I want to point out just how bold Paul is in this situation. He doesn't go in and soften his message, right? He doesn't enter the situation and talk about a personal perspective, He doesn't say like, oh, in the face of this accusation, don't worry, I'm not trying to change anybody else's belief here. I'm just talking about what it is that I believe, right? That could have been an answer that he gave. Like this doesn't, no, I'm not really trying to persuade anybody. He doesn't do that, though. He doesn't even say, like, this is my perspective. Like, you guys have your perspective, this is my perspective. Instead, he actually uses some evidence from within their worldview to try to communicate to them that his worldview is true and that he would rather have them step into his worldview. Sometimes it's easy for us to sort of personalize our faith when we get into a situation where there's pressure, right? And we probably don't face any pressure like the Areopagus, but on a day-to-day basis, sometimes we do face pressures. And one way that we can preserve peace at times is to personalize our faith. Or to say that, none of us have any certainty here. I'm just communicating about what I believe is true. And, I don't want to say anything about your worldview as long as, don't say anything about mine and we'll be good, And we sidestep that opportunity to display some boldness, okay? And I just noticed that Paul doesn't take that opportunity, and he doesn't sidestep boldness or the truth. He communicates it clearly. The way that he talks about it is also really interesting to me. So I think it's like, I think there's a train of logic that leads him to work from the inside of their worldview to talk about his own. And I kind of wanted to share that this morning too. But, it should be said that he talks to them with a respectful attitude. Paul doesn't try to drag people down when he's communicating his faith. But because of some of the basic tenets that he believes, I think that he has the ability to communicate to anyone about the truth of God. So if I could, I would break his argument down and then just kind of pick it apart, right? So in my mind, this is Paul's argument. He says, religious men of Athens, I've come to explain to you the truth of one of your altars, right? I believe it refers to my God. This God can't be housed. He doesn't need us for any form of sustenance. Rather, he's a creator with whom you owe your being and in whom you exist. in the past. He's overlooked your ignorance, but the time for correction has come. The time for repentance has come. He's appointed a day of judgment to be carried out by the man, Jesus Christ, and he has proven this to be true by raising him from the dead. And the argument that I see here is it begins with one of their own works of art, right? It begins with one of their own pieces of worship. And so I think here and in Romans, Paul communicates this idea that in the Christian worldview, we believe that as God has created the entire universe, and that because he's a near God, he's not a very distant God, but he actually is so near that every day we're moving in him. It's in him that we have our sustenance. And because of that, every person on the earth can look at creation and discern a little bit about God. And you see that pop up in Romans 2, where he talks about how he's displayed himself in his creation. And I think Paul kind of starts off with that here too. And he says that all the Gentiles around the world, and the Jews included, in the peoples of the world, are united in the fact that God has in some way clearly displayed some of his attributes. And we're kind of reaching for truth after that point, right? And this, to me, should be a breath of fresh air to us. It doesn't seem like it at first, but today we live in a society that's very inclusive. And in a lot of ways, this is a very inclusive statement. The statement is, God has displayed himself in creation to all people. He has, in a small measure, included everyone in his creation. And that every person can discern some small truth about God just from meditating on creation and their conscience to some degree. And Paul uses that as just like a little, to get his foot in the door, right? It's like a crack. It's like, I'm going to start with the assumption that everybody knows a little bit about God, and then I'm going to take what they do know, and I'm going to talk about God through what they do know, the good things that they do observe. And that's pretty different than, a lot of the ways that we will talk to outsiders. Sometimes when we talk to outsiders, we'll say things like, we'll just like pick out the big difference, right? And we'll just start blasting it. That's the thing that we want to talk about, and that's the way that we want to kind of persuade people who are not in the faith. But it may be a better way to listen to what people have to say and actually think about, their statements about religion or the way things are, and then look for some kernel in there that you can use to communicate the truth of Christ to that person. So if I were to take, an incorrect view of this sort of all-inclusive aspect of God and say it plainly, I would say that our culture kind of recognizes this idea that everybody knows a little bit of something and would have us say something like, God has revealed himself to all people. He's way bigger than me. If this is true, how can I be certain that my concept of God is superior to the concept of outsiders? So this is an incorrect way to go about this idea that God has presented himself in creation. And then lastly, the train of logic in my mind leads to, well, in that case, I'll boast about my uncertainty and I'll respectfully preserve the truth of others or the perception of others. And Paul doesn't really go that route in this passage. And I think that we should imitate him in choosing a route that's more like, God has revealed himself to all people in creation. If this is true, then deep in the worldview of outsiders, I should find a misunderstood pointer towards God. When I find these pointers, I can use them to correct the belief of outsiders and point them towards the truth of Christ and the resurrection. And so that's kind of one encouragement that I would offer, is to notice that that's what Paul does. He has complete certainty in his worldview, and when he interacts with others, he carefully listens to them, and he looks for opportunities to convert them to his worldview, right? Because he believes that there's life in it, and that there's truth in it. But as we know, when you do that, you can expect that things won't go well because they didn't go well for Jesus, right? You can look at Jesus and say, like, if I follow Jesus, the same thing that happened to him is going to happen to me. And similar things happen to Paul in this situation. So as he communicates about the superiority of his worldview, and he fleshes it out just a little bit, the archons of the Areopagus, they don't sentence him to death, so that's good for Paul, although Paul's road does lead there. Instead, they laugh him off the stage. So this Greek word that we read as sneer, it means to mock somebody. And so as Paul was like describing these truths about God and talking about how, I saw this altar that you guys had and I'm going to tell you about God through that, most of them thought it was ridiculous. And so they laughed at him. And only a few of them said, I'd like to hear a little bit more. And then like 2 of them converted, okay? And so I've thought about this a little bit too. I think one of our greatest fears in ministry in the United States as a Christian is this idea that if you share your faith, it's going to be seen as so intellectually irrelevant that you won't be taken seriously. That you're going to share with somebody and they're just going to be like, I don't even know how to respond to that because it's so dumb. Like what you just said is so dumb that I don't really even take it seriously, so I'm not offended, but I just think you're way out there. Like you're just so wrong that I don't even need to give emotional credence to like what it is that you're claiming. It's kind of like flat earth people. Is anybody a flat earth person? No? Good. Okay. I'm not going to offend any flat earth people. But there's like this whole movement of like flat earth people, right? And there's kids at school that are like into the whole flat earth thing, and they probably like it because it's like they can rile their teachers up like super quick if they talk about how the earth is flat. Basically, it's like these new people who, they don't think the earth is flat. They think any data that we have to suggest that the earth is a sphere is like made up by somebody in like a lab or something, I don't know. And that all the pictures we have from outer space are just manipulated photos from like Photoshop or the people at, ILM that do the Star Wars stuff. Maybe the ILM people are behind the spherical earth thing. But, so they don't think that. And sometimes you're like, if I communicate like the gospel and I really say like, I think this is true, are people going to look at me like those flat earth people, right? And I had like a time in class where I saw this happen to somebody, and it really hit home that like, oh man, I never want to feel that way. And I may tell this story, and it may remind you of being in a room where somebody like ousted themselves and this type of thing happened. But it comes from what I like to call the great microcosm of human experience, which is also known as middle school. So I was teaching middle school, right? And I'm like sitting there typing away on my computer, and out of nowhere, like all the kids were just like, what? I can't believe you really believe that? And it was like all of them, they just start like attacking this one kid. And I'm like, whoa, what's going on? And they're like, Billy, he thought that satellites were inside the Earth's atmosphere, right? And they're just like ganging up on this kid. And you're like, dude, Billy doesn't know anything about satellites. He's in 6th grade. Like, give him a break, And you're like, I don't know, Billy. Sorry, dude. You didn't know about the satellite thing, but whatever. Now you do. Sometimes you feel like that's how you're going to be treated as a Christian. If you're like, this is what I believe. Like, I believe all these truths in the gospel. It's like, at best, there's somebody there to be like, it's okay. He's like a Christian. We know they believe this stuff. It's fine. Like, just leave him alone. But at worst, you're like, am I going to have like a whole room of people down on me like right now if I communicate about this? And so there's lots of other examples, but I don't feel like I need to give any more. So that's tough. But that's like the worst thing that we really have to fear. That's kind of what Paul went through here, and I bet Paul would say like, I was stoned, and like, this was easier than that, or like, like post-mortem Paul Ghost is like, they killed me, so that Areopagus thing wasn't that bad. And it kind of puts things in perspective. that, for us, we really don't have that much to fear. All we have to fear is that somebody's going to think we're kind of stupid. And, so what? For me, there's lots of reasons to share the gospel. And I ask myself, how close am I mirroring Paul? What are my reasons to share? That type of thing. And I want to mirror Paul's boldness in this, and I want to have certainty about what I believe, and I want to communicate that certainty to other people. And sometimes, I'm afraid to do it. And like I said, there's lots of different reasons, and probably everybody in this room has a different reason for why they would share the gospel. You can share the gospel out of love, You can share the gospel out of concern for other people's well-being. One of the things that really gets me going, and this is self-oriented, but there's a passage, and I actually have the passage written down here, so Matthew 10:32-33, where Jesus says, "Therefore everyone who confesses me before men, I will confess him before my Father in heaven, but whoever denies me before men, I will also deny him before my Father in heaven." And those types of verses are the ones that get me going. And that may just be my own personal selfishness, and I'm just, letting you guys know I confess of it. But a lot of times the things that get me going are I'm like, what's going to happen to me? And this verse, Jesus is kind of answering that question where he's like, hey, look, at the end of time, when you are basically dependent on me acknowledging you to continue your relationship with the Father, if you don't acknowledge me, I'm not going to acknowledge you, right? And I think about that, and I meditate on it, and I'm like, dude, that's harsh, But it is a good driver for me. It may not be for everyone in the room, but it's a good driver for me to be like, I got to do this, and I may not feel like it, but I need to do this. And I was thinking about that, what does it look like when I share typically? And what would it look like if Jesus mirrored that when that final moment came? Okay, so this is a little thought experiment. I was thinking at my computer, I'm like, But if Jesus were to communicate about me the way that I at many times communicate about him with other people, it would look something like this. It would be I die, whatever, soul sleep or whatever you think happens. I'm waiting around, and then Judgment Day comes, and I'm standing there in front of everybody or whatever, and it's that moment where Jesus is going to be yeah, he's one of mine. And, he's communicating on my behalf, and he says something personally, I'd say I know him. But don't let that alter your decision in any way. I would encourage you to take the facts as they are and make up your own mind. I wouldn't want to influence you either way, Father, right? Or worse, what if in that moment he just didn't say anything at all, right? And so it's that time for him to mirror what I've done in my life, and he's just silent. And I just think about that, and it just, it weighs heavily on me, that possibility. And that drives me to really think okay, I need to be clear because I want him to be clear in the future, right? So, my final encouragement is just to encourage us all to live our lives in such a way that Christ will speak confidently on our behalf, right? Because we speak confidently on his behalf in his absence, in these moments with the people that we run into. So I'll pray, and then we'll get going. Lord, I pray that you would help us to be bold in situations where we have an opportunity to share the truth of your gospel. God, I pray that you would give us a confident heart, Lord, that you would strengthen our faith. God, that in the midst of any uncertainties, Lord, that we would continue reading your word and place our trust in you first and foremost. Lord, that you would give us words when we're with coworkers or friends or whoever it is, family, and we sense that there's an opportunity to speak about you, that you would be ever present on our minds so that we're ready to make connections. God, I pray that as we desire to do that, we would also carefully listen to the views of outsiders, Lord, and that you would give us insight into the bits of you that they perceive, And then help us to understand how we can expand that understanding, Lord, and point people to the ultimate truth that is Jesus Christ. God, be with us this week. Lord, I pray that if there was any part of this that was disorganized, or if there's part of this message that didn't quite become clear, Lord, that maybe a conversation would happen, it would be clarified. God, that you would take bits and pieces of it and use it to transform our interactions this week, Lord, and that we would have your Spirit as we leave church this morning. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.